Hi constant readers, welcome back to my channel, and today we are getting into yet another Stephen King classic, and that is Firestarter. If you're new here, I am making lots of videos now on my channel where I talk about Stephen King, and I'm hoping to sort of document my first impressions on each of his books as I work my way through them all. And if that sounds like something you're up for, then please consider subscribing. If you like this video as well, maybe drop a comment. I love to talk about Stephen King books, so that would be great. Now, let's get on to Firestarter. Now, I was surprised to see that this book didn't, at least in the version that I had, it didn't come with a foreword, and I appreciate the reading experience more if I get a feel for the context. So I did some research, some digging around, and I'll try and piece together what it was like when this was first published. So the year is 1980, Lennon was shot, Gacy was executed, and Stephen King has now made a fortune off of writing. He's moved into his now iconic Bangor mansion, which he still lives in today, the purchase of which was facilitated by his shift in publishing. He went from working with Doubleday to the New American Library, and I think this era is a major turning point in King's career. I think the problem was Doubleday had not treated King very well with his earlier works. Noisy birds. So, despite his first three novels, Carrie, Salem's Lot and The Shining, they were all very successful, but people around him were sort of rolling their eyes at what they saw as like a one-trick horror writer. You know, Doubleday wasn't putting the effort into his publications because they thought, oh, he'll have his 15 minutes of fame, then he'll fizzle out. He doesn't have the staying power because this genre, no one's taking it seriously. And King could tell that people were acting this way around him. Even today, Stephen King rejects any suggestions that he only writes horror novels. I think he once said in an interview that the only books that he considers pure, unadulterated horror of his would be Salem's Lot, you know, the vampire one, The Shining, and Christine. Because none of them offer any rationale. There's no explanation of why the supernatural events have occurred. And then sort of Carrie, The Dead Zone, Firestarter, these ones that deal with special powers, they're a lot more science fiction based. And The Stand is sort of a mix of the two. So enter the New American Library, also otherwise known as the NAL. They saw the talent and the marketability of Stephen King. They saw what like we all see today, but 40 years ago. They sort of treated Stephen King better, but they also printed his works in better condition. Like, they sold better because physically the books were a better quality. Like, the binding, you could see that more money was being put into his books. Like, when he was with Doubleday, The Stand, which by all means is a modern fan favourite of King's, The Stand only sold 50,000 copies in its first year, which is crazy when you compare it to Firestarter, which under the New American Library sold 280,000 copies in its first year. That difference is staggering. Like, Firestarter, a sort of B-tier Stephen King book, selling almost 6 times as much as The Stand. And I think even though King was battling his own personal demons, like mainly his alcoholism, but also his emerging cocaine addiction that would sort of plague him through the 80s, New American Library saw that King could become a household name. And they were clearly right, because at this point, if you're in a shop and there's books on the shelf, you will pick up a book and buy it just because it has his name on it, just because it says Stephen King. Because you know when you see that name that this is someone who has set a gold standard in modern day storytelling. I think it helps as well Stephen King's rise to fame at this point also coincides with the sort of second wave of horror movies. It's like another golden age from the sort of early 70s through to the late 80s. Like, King's work has always been very heavy on violence. It's always been very heavy on sex and the sort of tensions surrounding the youth. And I think this really resonates with the horror movie audience. So it was only inevitable that the general public would draw comparisons between the two and latch onto his name. And I think that's why at this point as well, we see so many of his books and short stories adapted into movies and television, because that was like the natural progression of his work. While I enjoyed Firestarter, I can admit it's not on the same level as some of his more classic works for a number of reasons. That doesn't mean I didn't enjoy it. I just don't think it's on the upper echelons. It's not firing on all cylinders. It doesn't help that both the 84 and the 22 movie adaptations are not very good. And I think the story as well suffers from a lack of identity in the sort of greater body of King's works. You know, he has like 60 plus novels. This one doesn't really stand out. If you want to read a story about a young girl battling supernatural powers, I feel like you're always going to pick up Carrie before you pick up Firestarter. Of course, playing devil's advocate, Stephen King has talked about the two books in comparison, and I do really enjoy what he said. He was asked if he thinks they're too similar in a Vanity Fair interview, and Stephen King actually had a great answer. He said that Firestarter's Charlie McGee, she is a superhero, whereas Carrie is an anti-hero. Charlie McGee has the benefit of a supportive home environment. Both her parents are very loving, in spite of her having these powers, and they both ultimately die to protect her, which is a very different situation to what happens with Carrie, as I'm sure we'll talk about on this channel inevitably. So even though Carrie is capable of catastrophe, so is Charlie. It never gets too bad in Firestarter because Charlie at least has a moral compass that sort of guides her throughout the story. Unfortunately, I would argue that also makes Firestarter more boring as a book, because that underlying optimism is less satisfying. You want to see her embrace the power and bring devastation to mankind. More often than not, that's why the sort of stereotypical sort of Jean Grey character gives into the Phoenix Force, because there's something gratifying about seeing a small town girl, you know, someone who is overlooked, grow into something greater than anyone could comprehend. Like, that's a satisfying story arc. I think that's why if you were going into Firestarter or you were rereading it, it helps to sort of look at the novel, I think, from a feminist point of view. Like, King has based the main character Charlie on his own infant daughter, Naomi, at the time. And he's talked about how his daughter, in her infancy, she had such a temper and she couldn't control her emotions very well. And we sort of see that translated here into a girl of about 7 or 8 who can make you burst into flames if you upset her. You know, the way that Charlie represses her power only to then revel in them. It seems to sort of stand in for the liberation of all women, to sort of see the female character become empowered and stand against this big corporation. There's something inspiring about that. It's frightening for the institution in the real world that sort of thrives off of putting women down, to have this very impressionable girl sort of rise up and end it all. And I think King is definitely in on the activism here. Like, there's more than a cheeky wink at the mediocrity of your typical straight white man. Like, when we look at the kind of men who run the shop, this government establishment, these FBI agents that pursue and later imprison Charlie and her dad, even the men at the top of the food chain, they're useless, they are egotistic. And that's how John Rainbird manages to sort of become so influential within that corporation. But we'll get to that. So the book starts, and we have Andy McGee and his daughter, Charlie. They're trying to escape FBI agents in New York. I do think in the first half of the book there's way too many flashbacks to before Charlie was even born. I think it would have made more sense, the story would have been more palatable, I reckon, if they'd compiled all of the flashbacks into some sort of prologue that takes place a decade before the main events of the story, only because there's so much back and forth and it just gets a bit nauseating. Like, we find out that Andy, in his college years, before Charlie was born, before he met Charlie's mum, he was hard up for cash, so he took part in a paid clinical research project. Now, we're going to talk about the experiment for a while, this Lot 6 experiment, because one, it's very important to the plot of the novel. It's where Andy first develops his powers, it's where he meets his future wife Vicky, together they have Charlie, but also this experiment is very bad, just from like a scientific POV. So we're going to get into it. Dr. Wanless is the lead on this experiment, and he's investigating the effects of a new chemical drug called Lot 6. He samples 12 college students to be his participants. Half of them are injected with the Lot 6 drug, the other half, the control group, are injected with a simple saline solution that won't do anything. And the experiment's double-blinded, so even the people giving the injections don't know who's going to get what. The design of the experiment, rubbish. It makes no sense that this study is cross-sectional. As in, they inject the college students, keep them for like a day or two, then just let them back into the wild. Besides the lack of generalizability, in that we have just 12 participants, which is such a small sample size, this study should be longitudinal. The participants being invited back periodically, that's what should happen, so that you can observe any changes in them over time. I mean, the shop is corrupt enough that they don't give the college students informed consent about the potential side effects of the drug. So if they're just going to ignore medical ethics entirely, it would have made more sense to just keep the participants as prisoners so that they could be closely monitored in the weeks, months, and even years after the fact. Because almost all of their participants who develop powers end up killing themselves because they were so tormented by something they didn't understand, and they could have easily prevented that from happening and then had more people to study had they just never let them leave. So I was really confused from like the villain's perspective that was how they decided to run the experiment. Didn't really make sense. And because Dr. Wanless just sort of let the participants loose, Andy and Vicky end up having a child together. They fall in love. They have a little girl named Charlie, who happens to have her parents' power, but it's multiplied because both her mum and dad receive the Lot 6 injection instead of the saline. The shop no longer seems to care about finding their original participants because it's such a clear game changer that Charlie has now superseded all of them in her potential. She's the first in a new generation of Lot 6, and that's exciting. Of course it is. I think Stephen King was inspired by his youth. There was lots of sort of LSD in college, and he was sort of fascinated by the various side effects of drugs in people and how they react to them. And you can sort of see him pondering like, oh, what would happen if those side effects became hereditary and passed through multiple generations? Which was something that at the time newspapers would scaremonger about. They would tell the youth that recreational drugs could lead to genetic defects and that you would be responsible for sort of cursing your children with these uncontrollable side effects. And that's what we're seeing here play out in Charlie McGee. It's sort of living propaganda. Sidebar as well, Dr. Wanless has quit smoking and he keeps destroying his cigarettes as part of his coping mechanism. And I thought that was sort of like a cheeky nod. It felt reminiscent of Quitters Inc., which is one of the short stories in Night Shift, which is his first anthology. I did a video on that as well. I'd recommend you check it out. Once again, we see in early King novels the themes of addiction and the sort of insidious nature of psychiatry. I always appreciate the semi-autobiographical touches in King's work, so I just wanted to give that a nod. Even when you ignore just how bad this experiment was, if Andy and Vicky were kept by the shop, I know I sound like a broken record, I actually think that would have made for a more interesting story, because that would have meant that, assuming they let them procreate, Charlie would be born into captivity, and there would be so many tensions and infighting between her parents and the shop. She would never sort of see the outside world, and you would see the effects of Stockholm Syndrome from her captors sort of play out. It would almost be like a sort of Stanford experiment in a novel. I don't know if that beats the first half of what we ended up getting in this book. Realistically, it plays out like a cat and mouse chase. I've never liked chase novels. I think they're drawn out. It's so clear that inevitably Andy and Charlie's luck will run out and they'll be captured by the shop, because the whole story can't be a chase. And King has even said himself that when he wrote Firestarter, he didn't actually know what was going to happen once the government caught Charlie and her dad. And that is what it feels like. The book has a sort of improvised nature to it, which I suppose can be enjoyable, but at the same time, it only goes one way that you'd expect it to. We go from a lot of chasing to a lot of sitting around waiting to escape. I don't think it's a satisfying read when we're told that this little girl has so much power, but we never really get to see her display it for most of the book. She just runs around with her dad and cries a lot. There's only really 2 instances where she goes full Super Saiyan and we see all the drama and the carnage. And I need more of that. I definitely needed more of that. Now, you might think that FBI agents with endless databases and tracking potential would find an everyday man and his infant daughter quite easily. However, Andy has his own power called the Push. The Push is Andy's power. It's this psychokinetic ability. He developed it after being injected with lot 6. Essentially, he can will a person to do something. Usually it's via like an oral command. It's very, these are not the droids you're looking for. It's very that. And if he pushes hard enough, people will do whatever he says without thinking about it. The problem is that while Andy uses the Push to cover their trail from the FBI, from the shop, each time Andy pushes someone, he accumulates more and more damage to his brain. It sort of presents as intense headaches that get harder to recover from. One of his eyes becomes bloodshot and starts to bleed. It's very debilitating. And the whole time you're thinking, oh no, is he going to be around to look after Charlie as it gets harder and harder to recover from? And I found the philosophy around that confusing. Maybe I'm overthinking it, but does Andy only damage his brain when he abuses his powers? Or is this like a snowball effect, where even the little pushes that he does contribute to a greater hemorrhage? Because King is seemingly suggesting that the damage Andy's doing is irreparable. So there's that lingering sense of dread with Andy. You're just sort of waiting for him to push too hard and die. Like, you can tell he's on borrowed time, and I think he knows that as well. I'm not sure if this happens because human bodies are not durable enough to contain these powers, or if it's more of like a stand-in for Faust, where the brain damage is like the price you pay for having to use these incredible abilities. But then Charlie seems to create fires without any physical repercussions. So I'm not sure why it's different. Is it because she's an adolescent and is still growing into it and still has potential? It's not really made clear, and I wish it was. We instead just sort of get Andy being this tortured soul throughout the book. He's just having a really hard time of it. We see another flashback where the shop first starts to pick up on the potential of Charlie McGee. Her mum, Vicky, only has mild powers. You know, like, they're not as significant as her husband, Andy's, and so that makes her expendable. The shop sends agents to force a confession out of her while Charlie's at school and Andy's at work. Vicky stays loyal to her family, obviously. She keeps her mouth shut. So the agents torture her, like they pull out her fingernails. It was very disturbing. I personally find things like that make me quite squeamish. Like, the scene was very upsetting because it culminates in Andy coming home from work and he has this undeniable sense that something is wrong. Like, this is another side of his psychokinetic abilities, and Charlie is the same. They both get hunches, which feels very relatable because I think we all have moments where our gut instinct about something turns out to be true and we're sort of like, aha, I told you so. Even if it's just like a confirmation bias, I feel like we still have those moments. Like, instinct is very real. Andy comes home early from work. He knows Vicky's in trouble. He can tell it. He can tell there's something wrong. And it seems irrational until he gets there and Vicky's missing. He searches the entire house several times over. Where is she? Where is she? We, like Andy, want to believe that she's all right, but I think we know where this is going. She might have left the house, but there's the small spot of blood next to the laundry cupboard, and he just knows. He knows what's inside that laundry cupboard, and he doesn't want to open it. He really doesn't, because he knows what will confront him when he opens that cupboard. And it was just really tragic, because it's that unavoidable trauma. Like, he could ever have imagined something being this big. Vicky's corpse tumbles out of the laundry cupboard. His dead wife has been all folded up. I thought King did a really good job of capturing the complex emotions at play here, because obviously Andy's overcome with grief. You know, this is the love of his life. She's been tortured and had a very undignified end. But then he realises Charlie, they've done this because they want Charlie. He needs to redouble his efforts to protect her. It's not just a case of him being her father. He now also has to be there as her mother, really, because she'll never see Vicky again. And now he needs to be twice the parent. I think at this point as well, the shop have already abducted Charlie from school, which felt very wrong to me, because even if you are the FBI, primary or elementary schools, they typically have a list of parents and guardians who are allowed to pick them up. And I think she said that she went home with a friend and then the shop sort of picked her up on the street. But still, it felt a bit sketchy. Like, I remember reading that part and just being like, something about that doesn't sit right with me. It's just funny because I feel like this isn't the first time I've talked about this in a Stephen King work. Like, in my video about Salem's Lot on this channel, the Glick brothers, like, they're only 8 and 12 or something, and they're walking through the woods on their own, and it just feels untenable because, of course, they then go missing, and it's like, are all American parents this irresponsible? Like, please let me know. Regardless, Andy travels at breakneck speed down the highway. He apprehends the shop agents at one of those... It's like a roadside parking lot, You know, the ones where they have like a couple eateries and you can fill up on petrol. One of those. What are those called? I don't know. But he goes to one of those because that's where the shop have parked their van. I think Charlie uses the toilet. I did enjoy the self-control that Andy demonstrates in this scene because these men have just tortured his wife. They have brutally murdered his wife, balled her up, stuffed her in a laundry cupboard. He could have done anything to them. And there's a point where he contemplates it. He's like, oh, you killed my wife? I'm going to mess you right up. But he instead decides to be the bigger person. It's very mature. It was a nice way of showing his restraint. And we also see a change in him later in the novel where he gets pushed too far and he does something that's a bit over the edge. But we'll get to that later. No, in this situation, he is very restrained. He makes one of the agents blind and the other one narcoleptic. He really just incapacitates them so that he can rescue Charlie. And I think as well it shows that he has his priorities straight. Like, rescuing Charlie was more important than seeking revenge, because what would that have solved if he had, like, tortured these two men? They get to New York. More agents are on their heels. One of them's called OJ, like that's his nickname, and they call him like the Juice. I was getting more OJ Simpson, but I don't think that had happened yet, so it's clearly not a reference to that when this was written. Andy and Charlie get a taxi cab. He pushes the driver into believing that the dollar bill that he gives him is worth 100, so he'll take them all the way to Albany for the airport. And I think they get to the airport and the idea is that, oh, we'll throw them. They won't know if we've taken a plane or if we've just gone down the turnpike. They're short of cash, so they see Charlie's powers sort of come into play. She overheats some public call phones and collects all the loose change. And then she gets quite distressed because while she's doing that, she inadvertently sets a man's shoes on fire while he was trying to use one of the call phones. And she sort of runs back to Andy in tears, and he reminds her that as long as she doesn't intentionally hurt anyone, things will be all right. Which is a philosophy that definitely changes at the end of the book. I mean, we will get there. But this is again what I was talking about, the idea of a moral compass. You really get a feel for their camaraderie, because even though at this point they're fugitives, they only have each other. Charlie's not going to go back to school. Andy's not going to go back to work. They've accepted that this is their life now. And it's tragic because Charlie is so young and she's never really known anything better than this. But with the shop still hot on their heels at the airport, they hitchhike to a rundown hotel. They stay for the night. Once again, the agents make the connection that they didn't take a flight at the airport. They found a hotel somewhere down the turnpike. Now, at this point, what happens next felt like it was a comedy, because the timing of this series of events plays out in such a silly way. The agents are coming up the road on their way to the hotel. They have to drive up like a hill. But then they shockingly get a flat tyre. This gives the McGees just enough time to hitchhike again, this time with a farmer named Irv Manders. It was crazy to me reading this, how this scene plays out. I think it's meant to build suspense, because this is the closest the agents have physically been to catching them, like they're just down the road. But the flat tyre was so Deus Ex Machina, it felt like I was reading Tom and Jerry. Like the ham-fisted henchman of it all. It wasn't, I don't think it had the intended effect. I wasn't on the edge of my seat reading it. I was just like, what's this? This is ridiculous. Alas, Andy and Charlie are on this big farmer's truck with Irv Manders. They give fake names. Andy is now Frank, and Charlie is now Bobby. The farmer is very kind. He invites them back to his farm in Hastings Glen. He can tell that they're hiding something, but he still treats them with ample kindness. They meet his wife, Norma. She makes them lunch. Charlie goes out and helps Norma feed the chickens, has a beer with Andy. It's all very pleasant, you know. The book has been very unpleasant up until this point. I think King is trying to tell us that even when you feel like the whole world is against you, there's always going to be that small minority of people who show you compassion and restore your faith in humanity. Because even after Andy confides in Irv that I was lying to you, my name isn't Frank, her name isn't Bobby, we're being chased by the government because she has these dangerous powers, he doesn't turn them out. He doesn't ask them to leave or suddenly, feel threatened. I think partly it's because he doesn't believe him, but it's still very trusting, since his whole house and farm is made of wood. If she really is a Firestarter, she could destroy everything. But trouble in paradise is just around the corner. OJ and the other agents show up at the farm. Once again, Irv stands firm in support of Andy and Charlie, even after he gets shot by one of the agents. It becomes clear to Andy that they no longer want him and are willing to kill him if it means securing Charlie. Speaking of the little Firestarter, she already anticipated that the agents were coming. Remember, like Andy, she gets the hunches, It's very Raven Simone. She's like, oh, that's so Raven. Like, she sees into the future. There's a moment where the temperature gauge in the Manders household skyrockets. Like, there's a little devil that represents when it gets really hot in the room, because she gets more fiery when she's stressed out. The agents try to convince her that she'll be looked after, but she's not stupid. Andy's told her what their intentions are. She knows why they want her. And it's upsetting because as much as she would like to use her powers freely, she's weighed down by the thought of doing the wrong thing and disappointing her father. So when he gives her the green light, she goes berserk. She goes ham on these agents. They are in agony. Like, the whole house and farm is also ablaze. The chickens explode. It's complete anarchy. And I sort of, again, see the anti-establishment side of this novel. The idea that the agents are encroaching on Manda's farm. It's unconstitutional. It's very American. It's like, look, we can't stand for this. The agents lose their cool quite quickly and flee from Charlie, who at this point is causing devastation to everyone around her. Andy has to physically step in and give her a smack to stop her because she's so swept up in her powers. And I think they toy with this concept, but it never really comes to fruition. The idea that she might enjoy her powers and go too far because she revels in them. I wish we would have had that moment, but we don't seem to. It's like another thing that never quite pans out the way you wanted it to in this book. Charlie faints as a result from using her powers so much. The Manders are horrified, but in different ways. Irv is horrified by how the shop would be so low as to try and abduct an infant from a farm, whereas Norma is horrified by Charlie herself. She calls Charlie a monster, although she does later apologise for that. And you can see it's more of a reactionary thing to having their family home destroyed. She's just like, all of our heirlooms are gone, you've taken everything. Irv offers Andy his Jeep because, again, Irv is very much of the mind that you're not in the wrong. Those agents shouldn't be trying to capture you. So Andy takes Charlie in the Jeep to her great-grandfather's home in rural Vermont. Yeah, Grantha McGee has since died, so Andy and Charlie have this big country estate all to themselves. And since it's situated quite remotely, the shop doesn't pursue them for several months. I think this is helped as well by Dr. Wanless, who has a conversation with Captain Hollister. Captain Hollister, or Cap for short, is the president of the shop. He's like the big cheese. He's the one who wants to keep the hunt for Charlie McGee going, because the incident at Manda's farm is so unexpected. They don't quite realise at this point who they're messing with, and many agents don't want anything to do with the case after what happened. But Cap is determined, seemingly out of fear of humiliation, because he's put so many government resources into the effort. And Dr. Wanless now gives him a very prophetic speech about how Charlie, being the product of not one but 2 Lot 6 parents, has what he calls the Z factor, meaning that her powers could be limitless, and so they really need to be careful with her. She could crack the earth open. She could make the sun expand. Wanless goes on by comparing Charlie to a young Milton, explaining that once she enters her pubescence, her powers could multiply in ways that could mean the end of the world as we know it. Cap doesn't seem convinced. Again, there's that ongoing theme of systemic prejudice. This older man can't accept, he's so unbelievably arrogant, the thought of this infant girl toppling everything he has built. It's untenable. We see the start of Charlie being this symbol of anti-patriarchy, and that's frightening to these men who sort of make a career off of putting women down. I think it's time that we talk about my favourite character. My favourite character by a country mile, John Rainbird. Rainbird is an agent for the shop. He's a Native American, he's a war veteran from Vietnam, and half of his face is badly disfigured to prove it. I think what makes Rainbird so interesting is that he's the only person in the whole story who appreciates the long game. If we look at the different sides at play here, Andy's running with Charlie, but he never actually has a plan for what they'll do if they make it out alive. And at the same time, the shop wants Charlie. They want to abduct her and they want to run tests on her. But for what? There's no specific aim set in place for her. Rainbird is the only one who is an opportunist. He makes these elaborate strategies, but then he's able to adjust them when circumstances get in the way. He's ruthless, he's methodical, he understands people. He really highlights how incompetent the rest of the shop is and out of touch they are, because he almost sort of reminds me of Chief Bromden, the character from King Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Not because they're both Native American, but because he's the sort of omega male. And what I mean by that is he is the living concept of the man who doesn't bother with social validation. In fact, he revels in being intimidating and making sure that people keep their distance from him. He sets his own goals for success. He's tenacious, but in a way that allows time for things to develop. He's not impatient. In a lot of ways, this whole novel is very similar to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, because it's about the nature of control and how the establishment tries to sort of tie people down and break the spirit of the individual, especially if they are different in any way that stands out and could be powerful. There's lots of comparisons. Cap is essentially Nurse Ratched. The way that she lobotomizes her patients, it's very similar to the way that Cap when Andy is captured, he's loaded with drugs like thorazine. For me, it's why Rainbird is secretly the most interesting part of the book, because he represents so many important ideas. He's like the embodiment of the plight of Native Americans. He's the embodiment of the neglect of of Vietnam War heroes. And he's the perfect foil to Charlie, because Charlie sort of just represents power that's genetic. Like, she has all this power and doesn't know what to do with it because she never acquired it herself. It was given to her. Whereas Rainbird is the opposite. He is this seasoned leader who comes from experience and skill. Like, everything that he has honed to perfection. I should probably note that Rainbird also has a rather peculiar fascination with Charlie that borders on paedophilia at times. Like, he keeps fantasizing about killing Charlie with one swift blow to the head, and like the mental image of shattering her skull and like splinters of bone stabbing her brain. It's horribly graphic, but he seems to get a kick out of it, and he's a bit of a sociopath. He visits Dr. Wanless and threatens him into telling everything he knows about Charlie and Andy. Rainbird, after the fact, kills Dr. Wanless. He sort of suffocates him. He like blocks his he blocks his airways. And I think in his sort of twisted mind, he's given Wanless a longer and more distressing death than what he plans to give to Charlie, as almost like a form of justice, because Charlie will die a painless and instant death, whereas Wanless, he's sort of acting as judgment. He's punished Wanless because he doesn't like the shop. He's sort of just working under them to take advantage and secure Charlie McGee. He still doesn't like Cap and any of the people that work under him. Meanwhile, Andy has hatched a plan to ruin the shop. He knows that they can't run forever, so it makes more sense to expose what they're doing to the press. He writes several letters explaining the situation with Charlie and the shop to go to the press, but as he posts them in the local town mailbox, an informant spots him and reveals his location to the shop. This is meant to be a big deal because the McGees haven't been disturbed for months, but at this point there are hundreds of pages left, so you'd be very naive if you thought that they were out of the woods. I also don't think Andy's plan would be very successful. Like, why would the press pick up a story that they have no evidence to substantiate? Like, it's a very far-fetched claim to say that you're being chased by the FBI for your powers. And I understand that journalists love to expose the government for its corruption, but there's no reason to believe that Charlie's a Firestarter from the offset. Like, they've already covered up the Manders Farm incident as an unrelated house fire. So I guess Andy is just desperate and is hoping that someone in the press will latch onto his story and the whole world will then find out. But I just don't see that ever happening. The shop also has access to a supercomputer that calculates the odds of where Andy and Charlie might be. So Cap already has an inkling that they are in rural Vermont. Rainbird wants to be on the operation, so he blackmails Cap. He's been collecting government secrets over the years, and so he easily has enough ammunition to ruin Cap. So he's sort of able to twist his arm into adding him to the hunt for Charlie, which is how he gets close to her in the first place. We get the sense that everybody working at the shop is terrified of Rainbird, but they don't want to show it because they all are quite narcissistic like that. I think it's partly because he's this tall Native American with half his face ruined. Like, physically he's quite imposing. but also mentally, he just has gravitas. Like, you can tell he walks into a room and the tone shifts immediately. He's mysterious because his motivations are unclear. Like, most of these agents are working for a paycheck, but Rainbird has no desire for material things. The only thing that he likes is shoes. He has a collection of shoes. I think my biggest problem with Firestarter is that there's not enough Rainbird, because he is the singular most interesting part of the whole story. Like, Charlie, as a little girl, doesn't have a personality yet, so her being the main character and the focal point feels off, because she's quite boring. Like, other people just project onto her. I would say this book is more of a battle of wills between Andy and Rainbird than it is anything to do with the actual Firestarter of the book. But this is where Rainbird gets more involved. He leads a squad of agents to form a perimeter around the McGee's household in Vermont. When Andy and Charlie step outside that morning, Rainbird shoots Charlie in the neck with like a sniper rifle. He's got a tranquilizer dart, so he incapacitates her. Andy is not very happy, but there's no time for screaming because the agents quickly surround them both and take them back to the shop. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. You know, I wouldn't do that. This book nosedives at this point. I mean, the chase, while predictable, was at least semi-interesting. But now we will stay at the shop headquarters for the rest of the book. The pacing is very strange, and I personally found this part of the book quite difficult to read. Like, I would have uploaded this video weeks ahead of time were it not for like the mental brain drain that this part of the book was giving me. Like, we spent so much time chasing, and now we're just sort of sitting around in the shop waiting for Andy and Charlie to escape. I didn't enjoy it. I think Firestarter is one of the more difficult King books to read because it really dips in the middle and it hits you hard and you don't expect it. So I'll try and summarise what transpires in the second half. So Cap now has Andy and Charlie in captivity. They have been separated. This is so that Andy won't push Charlie into burning the whole place down. They've both been loaded with Thorazine, which is a drug that will suppress their consciousness so that they won't conspire against the shop or lash out with their powers. Charlie is refusing to cooperate. She doesn't want anything to do with the psychiatrist. She just wants to see her dad. But Rainbird manages to make her acquaintance. During a blackout, he pretends to just be a janitor who cleans her room. He manages to relate to her, and it's very smart the way he does it. He uses his background as a Native American, being prejudiced against by white people, being a downtrodden war veteran of Vietnam. She empathizes with him. He even pretends to be afraid of the dark so that she can feel sorry for him while he's vulnerable. This, for me, was the scariest part of the book because he's so good at manipulating people and Charlie is so young and impressionable. It's a very detailed portrait of how children are groomed, which is a real thing that happens every day, and it's really not okay. Like, she doesn't get to spend any time with Andy, so she puts all of her trust, her hopes, her dreams, everything into Rainbird at this point. He becomes like a father figure to her. All the while, he's only playing her like a fiddle to win her favour so that she will use her powers. He compares his subterfuge to cracking open a safe, and it's just so heartbreaking because this little girl, just when you think she hasn't been through enough, losing her mum, now she can't speak to her dad, she develops this role model who's a lie. He's pretending the whole time just so that he can get through to her. Meanwhile, Andy is plotting. He develops a dependency to the Thorazine, like a drug addiction, but he manages to push his powers down enough that the shop starts to lose interest in him, thinking the effects of Lot 6 have worn off on him and that he's no longer psychokinetic, which is very clever on his part as well, because then he's allowed to get away with things in the shadows that they don't closely monitor because he's no longer a priority like Charlie. Like when he stops taking the pills so he's more alert, they don't notice. He's playing a risky game though, because if they think he's powerless, then he's no longer necessary, and they arrange for him to be sent to Hawaii, which is where he will be killed. But he does something very macabre. His psychiatrist, his name is Dr. Herman Pinchot, I think. Ironically, the psychiatrist is not a very stable person. He is... He cross-dresses and has a very peculiar obsession with the waste disposal, which, if you're not aware, I had to look it up, because we don't really get them in the UK anymore. It's an industrial shredder in the bottom of your sink, and it's very dangerous. So when Andy goes on walks outside with his doctor, he pushes him, not realising that Pinchot is already unwell, and his manipulations are creating an echo in Pinchot's mind, culminating with Pinchot going home, wearing his wife's lingerie, masturbating in it, and then putting his hand in the waste disposal, shredding it down to like a bloody stump, and killing himself in the process. Whoa. Pardon my French, but Stephen King, what the fuck? This scene is so messed up. I'm not surprised that neither film adaptation includes it, because it's so graphic, so demented. Like, I don't know. I don't know what Stephen King was thinking when he wrote that one. But it was an experience to read. And because I'd watched the movie versions first, I didn't know it was coming. And I was like, oh. The death of Pinchot is what gives Andy a chance to speak to Cap, though, because the boss of the shop suspects that Andy might have had something to do with his death, which he's right to suspect. But Andy quickly gets Cap under his thumb as well and pushes him into arranging a meeting between Andy and Charlie at the local horses stable. This is because Andy finds out that Rainbird has convinced Charlie to take part in the shop's tests in a sort of bartering exchange, where she gets to ride horses at the stables in exchange for tests. One horse in particular, called Necromancer. I'm not sure why that particular name. Maybe that's how Rainbird sees himself, like his power is death. But at least at this point, I got hope, because I was like, oh, there's an end game in sight. You know, we're done lollygagging around in this story. Rainbird will either kill Charlie if she resists too strongly, or Andy will save her from the shop. One of two things will happen. And it all comes to a head in the stables. It's sad, really, because Charlie hasn't had the privilege of being your everyday little girl. So her love of horses is almost like her trying to have a normal life. And so when these stables eventually blow up into flames, the symbolism is clear. She will never be an ordinary girl. Cap brings Andy to the stables himself. At this point, Cap is also feeling the echoes of Andy's pushing. Like, he's become mentally unstable. He's built up associations where he can think of nothing but his love of golf and his fear of snakes. And he keeps confusing various objects for snakes, and he keeps checking his car for snakes. It was very Indiana Jones. What Andy doesn't realise is that Rainbird has clocked his little plan. Rainbird used the supercomputer to draw a link between Pinchot, Andy, and Cap to see that Andy's powers are back, and he's been using them the whole time. He could tell that Cap was acting strange, and Charlie too, because Cap gave Charlie a message from Andy that told her not to trust Rainbird. So he knows it's, you know, it's time. He's hiding in the stables ahead before they even get there. He's got his gun at the ready. He's going to kill Charlie. It all happens so quickly. Cap sees a hose pipe on the wall of the stable and he just starts screaming like he thinks it's a snake. Rainbird shoots and kills Cap while an alarm goes off to the whole institute that Andy and Charlie are missing. Rainbird tries to get Charlie to climb up the ladder, but Andy sort of pushes her into not doing it. And so Rainbird makes the terrible mistake of shooting Andy in the head. Now, when you're a small child, your parents are your world, especially when your mother is already dead. So Andy is basically all that Charlie has left. So when she watches her dad get shot in the head and then cradles his dying body, you can imagine how distressed she might be. And in his dying breath, Andy tells her, "Burn it all. Show the world what happened here." And that's when you know that shit's gonna get real. Rainbird then tries to shoot Charlie, but that is a fool's errand because at this point she is ready to go off. She makes the bullet explode in mid-air and destroys Rainbird. Like, kill is not a strong enough word. His skin and flesh, like, melt off his bone. He is done. It gets very silly. Like, Charlie goes full Godzilla. She destroys the entire compound. She kills everyone who gets in her way. It's so overdue that I was actually disappointed with the ending. Like, Charlie goes back to only... It just, I don't know. I just don't think it's a very good ending. Because we waited so long for it that when it did happen, it was just disappointing. But anyways, she returns to the only people who ever showed her compassion, the Norma Manders. How did she find Hastings Glen when the shop is in Virginia? I don't know. We don't get to see her journey there. The shop has a new leader who is still looking for Charlie, even after she destroyed everything. And the book ends with her... She realises that she can't stay with the Manders forever. Something's got to give. So she goes to this big newspaper press and essentially finishes what her father couldn't. She shows the boss her powers. Like, she makes a flame in her hand. I think the idea is that she's tired of hiding it and being ashamed for who she is. She's ready for the world to know what she's been through. Which... it's definitely an ending. Sure, that's how it ends. Firestarter also has 2 movie adaptations. One in 1984, that's fine, and one in 2022 that's terrible, like a pure disaster. King has talked about how the 1984 adaptation was one of the first times that a movie based on his work actually made him money. Because up until this point, Doubleday had taken 50% of the profit off the top and had paid him what was left. So he never really got enough to make it feasible. But this time it was different. And there's an adorable photo where Drew Barrymore is like lighting Stephen King's cigar. It's very cute. The cast of the 84 version, my goodness, everyone's talented. Even baby Drew Barrymore is so endearing. But because the book doesn't pace itself properly, you can see the sort of actors thinking out loud on screen. Like, they're so directionless in every scene because no one's steering the ship. The special effects in the 84 version are also quite comical. Like, when Charlie destroys the shop at the end, she turns into like a military grade battleship. Like, she seems to be like firing torpedoes out of her hands at people, and it's really silly. It's really, really silly. Even though the 84 version is no masterpiece, it at least stays accurate to the book and is full of good performances. And the same cannot be said about the 22 version. Charlie is played by the same little girl, actually, from It Chapter 2, the one that got eaten by Pennywise under the bleachers. There's just so many weird choices in this version. Like, it's far less book accurate. Cap is a woman, which made no sense given the thematic misogyny in the book. Rainbird receives Lot 6 and has powers. Again, why? That makes no sense. The mum is in more of the story, and the last 20 minutes is a pure dumpster fire. I actually have a video on my channel from last year when that movie first came out, and my opinions haven't changed if you want to go see that video. Like, this film is awful and should never have been made. If I was really pushed to find something credit-worthy, the special effects look better because it's a modern film, and Zac Efron does a passing job as Andy. He does a better job, actually, than the 84 version does. Yeah, I don't think the 84 version realised that Andy is a tormented soul. Like, he's a single parent on the run with tiny brain hemorrhages popping inside of him. Like, he is having a rough time of it. But in the 84 version, he's way too chipper. Like, Zac Efron gives the character more nuance. So, props to Zac Efron, I guess. Even though he takes steroids. Well, I said it. It's funny as well how in both versions, the push looks really stupid too. Like, in the 84 version, Andy sort of, like, grabs his temples and squints. He's like, And in the 22 version, Andy's eyes, like, bleed a lot. I think mind control almost always looks stupid on screen because it's not like Charlie's abilities. Like, fire's always going to look cool because it's very visually appealing. So that's it. That's Firestarter. I'm not the biggest fan of it. I think I've made that very clear in this video. It's not bad. I just wouldn't call it like a classic. I wouldn't call it a King classic. I think the theme of anti-establishment is cool, and it reflects the changing King's political beliefs, especially at this point in his life. Like, he's reeling from the fallout in Vietnam, and it's his college years. But this was already explored in The Stand and in The Dead Zone. So Firestarter sort of fails to stand out. It doesn't have its own niche in King's full body of work. I do love that Charlie McGee is like the novel's heroine and also a terrifying force of nature. Like, she overcomes every challenge that's thrown at her, and that's commendable. But if this book had just been looked over by an editing eye, just to refine it, move some things around in the sequence, cut about 100 pages because that middle bit does really dip, I think it would make for a much better reading experience. It would be more palatable overall. But yeah, thank you for watching, and as always, toodaloo.